5 million people lost power at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in February. Not all at once. The cascade took 4 minutes and 19 seconds, which is an eternity in grid management and no time at all in the physical world, and by the time the Apex Grid Solutions Operations Center in Detroit registered the full scope of the failure, the temperature outside was 14 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Hospitals were on backup generators. Traffic systems were dark. The SCADA network, that managed load distribution across Michigan's Lower Peninsula, had entered a fault state that Conrad Voss's engineering team had been staring at for 6 hours without resolving. The fault was in a subsystem they didn't fully understand. Not because the documentation was incomplete. It was extensive, thorough, the product of 11 years of meticulous record-keeping. The problem was that the documentation described what the system did. It did not describe why one specific error recovery layer existed, what it was protecting against, or how to reset it manually when it entered a locked state under sustained thermal load. That knowledge lived in one place. It was on a laptop, 2020 model, brushed gray lid, a strip of electrical tape across the hinge, with the letters NW, local only, written in permanent marker. The laptop was in the second bedroom of a 2-bedroom apartment on Michigan Avenue in Ypsilanti, 45 minutes from the Apex Operations Center. The man who owned it was named Nathan Webb. He was 41 years old, a single father, and his current job title was IT support technician at a logistics company in Ann Arbor that processed shipping manifests. He had designed the SCADA system himself. He had also, when Conrad Voss's restructuring team had ended his contract in 2020, embedded a thermal fault recovery layer into the system's base architecture that he had never documented. Not from malice, not from strategic foresight, but because the layer had been a late addition, coded in a week when the project was supposedly finished, and he had run out of time to write it up properly before the contract ended, and had told himself he would send the documentation later. He had not sent it. At 1:14 a.m., Nathan Webb's phone rang. Stay with this. Because the man they told they no longer needed was the only person alive who could bring 5 million people's lights back on, and the answer was 45 minutes away, on a laptop, with a piece of tape on the hinge. Nathan Webb lived in Ypsilanti in an apartment that had been built in 1962 and that showed it in specific ways. The kitchen tiles were avocado green under the grout. The radiators knocked in cold weather with a sound his daughter had named Percy, and the second bedroom window had a gap at the bottom that he had addressed with a line of weather stripping that was adequate for 3 seasons and insufficient for the 4th. February was the 4th season. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a living room that doubled as Nathan's workspace when Iris was asleep, a kitchen, and a bathroom that had been renovated at some point in the 1990s in a way that was now dated enough to have completed the loop back to interesting. The second bedroom, where Iris slept, had glow-in-the-dark constellation stickers on the ceiling that she had put there herself, arranging them in patterns that were not quite the actual constellations but were, she had explained to Nathan, better ones. Iris was 7 years old. She had Nathan's eye for systems. She was the kind of child who, when given a new toy, read the instructions before opening the package, not because she was cautious, but because the instructions were part of the object, and ignoring them seemed incomplete. She had brown eyes and the particular laugh of someone who finds things funny earlier than the people around them, a half second ahead of the joke, which had the effect of making other people funnier than they actually were. She had one specific habit that Nathan found both characteristic and inexplicable. She kept a running list, in a small spiral notebook she carried in her backpack, of questions she could not answer. Not homework questions. Questions that occurred to her in the course of the day and that she had not been able to resolve through thinking about them. The list was organized, not by subject, but by how long she had been thinking about a question without resolution. The oldest question on the list, which had been there since she was 5, was, why does ice make that sound when it melts? Nathan had answered this question 3 times. She kept it on the list because, she said, she wasn't sure she understood it yet. The laptop with the tape on the hinge was on the desk in the living room. It was not hidden. It was simply there, because Nathan used it occasionally for personal projects and because it was a functional machine, and there was no reason not to use it. The source code of the Apex SCADA system was on it because he had been working from that machine during the final months of the project and had never transferred the files elsewhere. and because after the contract ended, he had kept them the way you keep the files of a finished project. Not for any particular purpose, but because deleting them had felt like a different kind of ending than the one he had already had. He had not opened the SCADA directory in 14 months. He worked the IT support position because it was there, and because the hours were compatible with Iris's school schedule, and because the work, while considerably less complex than what he had spent 11 years doing, was not nothing. There was still the specific satisfaction of locating the problem in a system and understanding it and fixing it, which was the satisfaction that had driven him into engineering in the first place, and which had not changed because the systems had gotten smaller. On the evening before the storm, Iris had asked him to look at the list. She did this occasionally, not for help answering the questions, but to see if Nathan thought any of them should come off the list, because they had been there long enough. He looked at the list. He told her the ice question could come off if she felt she understood it. She said she didn't. He said it could stay. She said, "Dad, what happens when a system you built breaks and someone else is trying to fix it?" He looked at her. "They fix it or they don't," he said. "What if they can't?" He thought about this. "Then they call the person who built it," he said. She wrote something in the notebook. He did not ask what. The restructuring of Apex Grid Solutions' technical staff in 2020 had been framed in the company's internal communications as a strategic pivot toward managed services. Nathan had understood this argument. He had also understood that it was not the primary reason for his departure, because the primary reason was that Nathan had spent the preceding 18 months in increasingly direct conflict with the direction Conrad had set for the system's expansion. A direction that prioritized throughput metrics over resilience margins, that, in Nathan's assessment and in 2 written memos he had submitted through proper channels, created a category of thermal fault scenarios that the system's existing recovery architecture could not handle without a layer that did not yet exist. Conrad had reviewed the memos. Conrad had thanked Nathan for his thoroughness. Conrad had approved the expansion as planned. Nathan had coded the recovery layer anyway. In the final 6 weeks of his engagement, working evenings after his regular project hours, because the layer had not been approved as a scope addition, and he was not going to bill for work he had added himself. He had embedded it in the base architecture in a way that was technically correct, structurally sound, and entirely invisible to anyone reading the documentation, because there was no documentation. He had intended to write the documentation. He had not written the documentation before the contract ended. He had sent one email, 3 months after his departure, to the technical lead who had taken over his work, a man named Peter Gale who was competent and careful. The email had said, in its entirety, "Peter, there is an error recovery layer in the base architecture, section 7.4.2, that is not in the current documentation. I've been meaning to write it up. If you have any questions about the thermal fault scenarios in the expansion zones, you should be aware it exists. I can send details if useful." Peter had replied, "Thanks." Nathan noted, "Things have been hectic here, but I'll flag this for documentation review." Documentation review had not happened in the 14 months since. The storm that hit Michigan's Lower Peninsula on the second Tuesday of February was a Category 3 winter event, not the most severe scenario, not unprecedented, but sustained. 48 hours of temperatures between 8 and 18 degrees Fahrenheit, significant wind loading on transmission infrastructure, and the specific combination of sustained cold and reduced demand management that created thermal stress patterns in the grid's load distribution logic that Nathan had modeled in 2019 and that Conrad's expansion had, exactly as Nathan's memos had predicted, made more likely. Nathan had been asleep for 2 hours when the cascade began. He had been asleep for 3 hours and 47 minutes when his phone rang. The number that appeared on his screen was an 800 number he did not recognize. He answered it because 1:14 a.m. calls from unrecognized numbers, when you have a 7-year-old, have a specific quality of urgency that overrides the normal calculation. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, professional and controlled in the way of someone who had been professional and controlled for 6 hours and was getting close to the edge of it. She said, "Is this Nathan Webb?" He said yes. She said, "My name is Renata Solis. I'm the Systems Operations Director at Apex Grid Solutions. We have a fault condition in the SCADA base architecture, section 7.4.2. We've been in recovery mode for 6 hours. "We can't resolve the locked state. Peter Gale gave us your number. He said you might know what this is." Nathan sat up. He said, "Is Percy running?" She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Subsystem 3, the thermal monitor. In the operations interface, it renders as a small gauge in the lower left of the dashboard. Does it have a blue indicator or a gray one?" A pause. He heard her relay the question. He heard someone say gray. He said, "Then the recovery layer has locked. That's section 7.4.2. I know what it is. I need my laptop." He was on the laptop in 4 minutes. Not because he had been in a hurry. He had gotten Iris's door checked, which she kept closed, which meant the hallway light wouldn't wake her, and he had made coffee, because what was coming was going to take a while, and doing it without coffee was not a consideration. Then he had opened the laptop, gone to the SCADA directory, and been sitting at his desk with the source code open and Renata's number on speaker for approximately 90 seconds before he understood the full shape of the problem. The recovery layer in section 7.4.2 was exactly where he had left it. It was intact. It was functional. It had in fact triggered correctly, which was the problem, because the trigger had been correct, and the manual reset had not been executed correctly. And now the layer was in a locked state that was preventing the fault from resolving in either direction. "Okay," he said. "The layer triggered at the right time. The issue is the reset sequence. Your team has been running the standard recovery protocol, which doesn't account for this layer because it's not in the documentation." Renata said, "What's the correct sequence?" He paused, not to think about whether to tell her. That was not a question he entertained. He paused because he was looking at the code, and the reset sequence was in a conditional block that was dependent on 2 state variables whose current values he didn't know. "I need to know the state of 2 variables before I can give you the sequence," he said. "Can you put someone on the terminal at the operations console who can read variable states in the architecture log?" She said she could. "This is going to take about 40 minutes, he said. "I need to walk someone through the log structure. It's not difficult, but it's also not something you can do without the walkthrough. Are you okay to stay on the call?" She said yes. He took a sip of coffee. He looked at the code. He thought about the 48 hours in February 2019 when he had first written this layer, at this same desk in a different apartment. Iris asleep down the hall at the age of 3. The modeling data from the thermal stress scenarios open on a second screen. The specific satisfaction of solving a problem that hadn't been asked for, but that he had been certain would eventually matter. He began the walkthrough. The apex technician on the terminal was a young man named Cassidy, who had been on shift for 9 hours, and who had, Nathan assessed within the first 2 minutes, a solid grasp of the architecture log structure and the specific combination of fatigue and focus that comes from spending 9 hours on a problem that hasn't resolved. Cassidy did not ask unnecessary questions. He read what Nathan asked him to read. He entered what Nathan asked him to enter. 38 minutes after the call began, section 7.4.2 exited its locked state. The cascade recovery took 11 minutes after that. Grid sectors came back online in the sequence Nathan had designed them to restore in prioritizing hospitals, then water treatment, then residential heating zones, in the specific order that minimized re-energization stress on the transmission infrastructure. Nathan watched the status indicators he was running in the SCADA viewer on his laptop. He said nothing while the sectors restored. He waited for the last residential zone to confirm, which it did at 2:43 a.m. He said, "That's everything." Renata said, "That's everything." A silence. He said, "The documentation for that layer, I'll write it and send it to you this week." She said, "I have some questions I'd like to ask you before then." He said he understood. He closed the laptop. He checked Iris's door again. He went to bed. Renata Solis drove to Ypsilanti on Thursday morning. Not because the conversation required her physical presence. It could have been a call, a video meeting, any of the standard remote options that had become the default for professional communication. She drove because she had spent Tuesday night and Wednesday processing what had happened, and what had happened required, in her assessment, a conversation that was not mediated by a screen. She was 46 years old, had been Systems Operations Director at Apex for 7 years, and had managed 11 significant fault events in that time. She had never managed one in which the resolution depended on a person who was not employed by the company, was not on any consulting roster, and was reachable only because a former colleague had kept a cell phone number in a personal contact list for 4 years out of professional instinct. She sat across from Nathan at the kitchen table. Iris was at school. Nathan had made coffee. The laptop with the tape on the hinge was on the desk in the living room behind him, visible through the kitchen doorway. She said, "Walk me through the layer." He walked her through it. Not the reset sequence that she had now documented, written up in the 4 pages he had emailed her at 6 a.m. Wednesday. He walked her through the decision that had produced it, the modeling work from 2019, the thermal stress scenarios, the 2 memos, the expansion that had been approved over his objections, the 6 weeks in which he had coded a solution to a problem that Conrad Voss had determined was not worth solving. She listened without interrupting. She had the quality of someone who was extremely good at her job, and who knew it and who did not need to demonstrate it by talking. When he finished, she said, "The memos, are they in the project documentation?" "They should be," he said. "I submitted them through the standard channel." "I couldn't find them," she said. "I went through the project archive yesterday. There are routing records showing they were received. There's no copy of the content." Nathan looked at her. "They were reviewed and acknowledged by Conrad directly," he said. He replied to both. "Do you have the replies?" He did. He had kept them in a personal email archive that he had exported when his Apex account was deactivated, which was standard practice for anyone who had spent 11 years in contracted technical work and had learned early that institutional archives were less reliable than personal ones. He showed her the email thread. She read it on his phone, at the kitchen table, with the specific focus of someone reading something for the first time and understanding its implications while reading. Conrad's replies were brief. In the first, "Thanks for the analysis, Nathan. We've reviewed the risk profile and are comfortable proceeding." In the second, 3 months later, after Nathan's follow-up, "Nathan, we appreciate the diligence. The technical team has reviewed the expansion parameters. We're confident the existing architecture handles the scenario within acceptable tolerances." Renata read both replies. She read them twice. She said, "He received a technical analysis in 2019 saying the expansion would create fault scenarios the existing system couldn't handle." "Yes," Nathan said. "And he approved the expansion anyway." "Yes. And the layer you coded, the one that resolved Tuesday's fault, you coded it specifically in response to that scenario." "Yes, without billing for it. The scope wasn't approved," he said. "I wasn't going to bill for out-of-scope work." She looked at him. "Nathan," she said, "the layer that kept 5 million people's power on in a February storm was coded by someone who wasn't being paid to code it, wasn't authorized to code it, and wasn't thanked for it. The layer did what it was supposed to do," he said. "That's the point of the layer." Renata's investigation of the project archive took 3 weeks. She did it herself, not because it was her job, it wasn't strictly her job, but because she had been on the phone at 1:14 a.m., while 5 million people were without heat in February, and what she had found in that phone call had a shape she needed to understand completely before she could decide what to do about it. Nathan Webb had joined Apex Grid Solutions in 2009 as a senior systems engineer. He had been promoted to chief architect in 2012. The SCADA system that managed Michigan's Lower Peninsula grid had been, in 2009, a vendor-purchased platform with significant operational limitations. In Nathan's first 3 years, he had rebuilt its core architecture from a vendor-dependent framework into a proprietary system that was faster, more resilient, and substantially cheaper to operate than the platform it had replaced. The rebuild had saved Apex approximately $2.1 million annually in licensing costs, and had been approved as a continuous improvement initiative rather than a capital project, which meant it had been completed without the level of executive visibility that a capital project would have received, and without the formal attribution that typically accompanied work of that scale. The system that was currently managing power distribution for 5 million people was, in its essential architecture, Nathan's work. Not Nathan contributing to a team's work, not Nathan as one of several key contributors. Nathan's work produced over 11 years of continuous development, with the foundational decisions, the architecture, the load management logic, the fault tolerance design, the error recovery framework, traceable to his choices and his modeling, the commit history, which had been archived when Apex migrated to a new version control platform in 2021, and which required a data recovery request to access, showed 4,847 commits over 11 years. Nathan's username was on 3,219 of them. Renata sat with this number for a while. She also found the contract termination documentation. It was standard. A notice of restructuring, a severance calculation, a non-disparagement clause, a provision that assigned all intellectual property developed during the engagement to Apex Grid Solutions. She found one more thing. In January 2023, 14 months before the fault event, a regulatory filing by the Michigan Public Service Commission had cited the Apex SACA system as an example of best practice grid management architecture in the state. It had credited Apex Grid Solutions for the system's development. It had not mentioned Nathan Webb. She called Conrad Voss. Conrad Voss was 53 years old now, 4 years into his tenure as CEO, and he had the quality of a man who had spent a long time making decisions that were correct by the metrics he was measured against, and who had not thought very often about the metrics he wasn't. The call with Renata lasted 40 minutes. She told him what she had found. She told him about the memos and the replies and the undocumented layer and the commit history. She told him about Nathan at his desk at 1:14 a.m., with the laptop with the tape on the hinge, walking an exhausted technician through a code structure that existed because Nathan had coded a safeguard that Conrad had decided wasn't worth the scope addition. Conrad listened. He said, when she finished, that the termination of Nathan's contract had been a business decision made in a specific financial context, and that the company's IP assignment provisions were standard industry practice. Renata said, Conrad, the reason the layer is undocumented is that he coded it in the last 6 weeks of his contract after his scope change request was denied, because he was certain the expansion would create a fault scenario the system couldn't handle. He coded it on his own time and didn't bill for it. Then he emailed Peter Gale, 3 months later, to flag that it existed. That email is in the archive. Peter replied and said he'd flag it for documentation review. Documentation review never happened. Conrad said, Renata, 5 million people, she said. A silence. He said, what exactly are you asking me to do? She said, I'm asking you to understand what we have, which is a grid management system that was essentially built by one person over 11 years, who we terminated in a restructuring and who we have since paid nothing, credited nowhere, and contacted only when the system he built encountered a problem only he could solve. Conrad said, the IP assignment. I know about the IP assignment, she said. I'm not asking about the legal question. I'm asking about the right one. Nathan Webb walked a technician through a reset sequence at 1:14 in the morning, while his daughter was asleep down the hall, she said. He did it because he was the only person who could. He also told me, at the end of the call, that he would send the documentation that week. Not I'll think about it. Not let's talk about a consulting arrangement. He said I'll send it. And he did. At 6 a.m., 4 pages, completely documented, no compensation discussed. Conrad was quiet. I know, he said. It was not a legal answer. It was not a business answer. It was the specific 2 words of a man who has been told something clearly and has understood it clearly and has no defense that he himself believes. The financial constraints, Renata had calculated, amounted to approximately $340,000 in additional engineering costs that the scope addition would have required. The fault event on Tuesday had cost Apex Grid Solutions, in regulatory response costs, emergency protocol implementation, and reputational management, approximately $14.7 million. The undocumented recovery layer had prevented an outcome that Apex's own risk consultants, retained after Tuesday, estimated could have cost between $180 million and $2.3 billion depending on duration, in regulatory penalties, liability claims, and infrastructure repair. The meeting was in Detroit, at Apex's operations center, 3 weeks after the fault event. Nathan drove up on a Tuesday morning. He brought the laptop, not because the meeting required it, but because it felt right to have it there, in the building where the system lived, after 4 years of carrying the source code on a machine in a second bedroom in Ypsilanti. Conrad Voss was in the room when Nathan arrived. Also present were Renata, the company's general counsel, and the head of engineering, Dr. Yale Brenner, 43, who had been the technical lead during the fault event, and who had heard Nathan's voice on speaker from the moment Renata patched her in. She introduced herself and said, "I've spent 3 weeks going through the commit history. I have about 40 questions." Nathan said he was happy to answer them. Conrad said, "Nathan, before anything else, I want to acknowledge what happened on Tuesday night and what it represents about the last 4 years. I received 2 memos in 2019 that told me specifically what would happen. I made a financial decision that I was comfortable making at the time, and that I am no longer comfortable with, in part because of what it cost operationally, and in part because of what it cost you. The termination was a business decision. The failure to document the layer, the failure to follow up on Peter's email about Section 7.4.2, the failure to credit the architecture appropriately in any public or internal documentation, those were institutional failures that were, at minimal, failures of oversight that I was responsible for and did not exercise." He set the term sheet on the table. Nathan looked at it. He did not pick it up immediately. He said, "The documentation for the full system, the undocumented elements, not just Section 7.4.2. I've been working on it. I can have a complete set of documentation ready in 6 weeks." Yael said, "I know. I've seen the 6 a.m. email. 6 weeks is faster than any of us could do it." 8, Nathan said. "I'll do it in 8. The 6-week version would be complete but not well organized. 8 weeks and it will be usable for the next 20 years. Yael looked at Renata. 8 weeks, Renata said. 8 weeks, Conrad said. Nathan picked up the term sheet. He read it carefully, which was the only way he read things. The retrospective payment was a number that landed in the category of large. The advisory rate was the number of someone who understood what the system was worth and who the person across the table was. The attribution language was precise and unambiguous, and covered every public venue in which the system had been credited to the company rather than to its architect. He set the term sheet back down. "The retrospective payment," he said. "I'd like to discuss the structure." The general counsel leaned forward. "The number is not the issue," Nathan said. "The structure is. I have a daughter in 2nd grade who is going to need college eventually. I'd like the payment structured in a way that maximizes what I can do with it for that specific purpose. Is that a conversation we can have?" Nathan said, "One other thing. The Peter Gale email. The one where he said he'd flag it for documentation review. I don't want that to be part of whatever narrative comes out of this. Peter did what he said he'd do by flagging it. The documentation review not happening was an institutional failure, not Peter's. I'd like that distinction to be clear." Conrad said, "Noted." Renata looked at Nathan. She had the expression of someone who had driven to Ypsilanti, not knowing what she would find, and had found exactly what she should have expected, a man who answered the phone at 1:14 a.m., fixed the system, sent the documentation, and then showed up to a meeting about what he was owed and used his first discretionary request to protect someone else. The public attribution came first, because it was the simplest thing to do, and because Renata had argued, successfully, that starting with it established the tone for everything that followed. The correction to the Michigan PSC filing was submitted in March, 6 weeks after the fault event. It was a 1-paragraph amendment that identified Nathan Webb as the principal architect of the Apex SCADA system and credited him with the system's foundational design, its fault tolerance framework, and its error recovery architecture. The amendment noted that prior filings had attributed the system's development to Apex Grid Solutions without adequate acknowledgement of the individual contributor responsible for its core design. What drew coverage was the technical conference in May. Yael Brenner contacted the symposium organizers in April and asked whether a co-presenter could be added. The co-presenter she had in mind was Nathan Webb, whose foundational work on the system she was presenting was the actual basis for the session's content. Nathan had not presented at a technical conference since 2018. He had, in the intervening years, been in rooms with colleagues who did not know he had built the thing they were discussing, and had said nothing, which was its own specific experience, not painful, exactly, but like wearing a coat in a room where you were the only one who was warm and the others were discussing warmth as an abstract concept. At the symposium, they presented to an audience of 340 grid systems engineers. Yael presented the operational data. Nathan presented the architecture, the decisions, the logic, the specific choices that had been made in building a system designed to manage the complexity of a modern grid without failing at the moments when failure was most costly. He was not uncomfortable with the presentation. He had given versions of it, internally, many times between 2009 and 2020. What was different now was that his name was on the slide. Afterward, at the reception, a man Nathan didn't know came up to him and said he had recognized the architecture from a technical brief he had read 3 years ago that had described the Michigan grid's resilience characteristics without naming a designer. He asked Nathan how long it had taken to build. Nathan said, 11 years. The man said, "How do you build something for 11 years? Nathan thought about this. "You fix the things you can fix," he said, "and you document what you know, and you add the safeguards that aren't in the scope because you know they'll matter eventually, and you keep the source code." The man laughed. Nathan drove home to Ypsilanti. It was late May, which in Michigan had the quality of a promise. Still tentative, still cold at night, but moving in the right direction. He arrived home at 10:30. Iris was asleep. He checked her door. He went to the living room and sat at the desk with the laptop. He did not open the SCADA directory. There was no reason to. The documentation was nearly complete. The system was stable. The layer was no longer a secret. He sat at the desk because it was the desk, the same chair, the same window overlooking Michigan Avenue. He thought, the system works. The safeguard held. The documentation exists now. It was enough. The documentation took 7 weeks. Not 8, 7. Because Nathan had underestimated his own pace when the problem was clearly defined, and the only constraint was time. He worked on it every evening after Iris was in bed, and on Saturday mornings while she did her own reading or worked on the questions in her notebook. The documentation was 312 pages. It covered every undocumented element in the system's architecture. It was organized in the way Nathan organized everything, clear, hierarchical, annotated with the reasoning behind decisions rather than just the decisions themselves, because the reasoning was what allowed the next person to work with it correctly. He sent it to Yael on a Monday morning. She replied in 4 hours. "This is extraordinary. The explanation for the load balancing logic in Section 4 alone. I've been working around something I didn't understand for 18 months. Now I understand it. Thank you." Nathan replied, "There's a Section 4 errata document I should also send." Some of the load balancing decisions were provisional when I implemented them and were updated in 2017. The 2017 updates are in the main documentation, but the context for why the provisional decisions were made is in the errata. I'll send it tomorrow. He sent it the next morning. The advisory arrangement formalized in April. Nathan worked 2 days per week for Apex, Tuesdays and Thursdays, in person at the Detroit office when the work required it, remotely when it didn't. The arrangement was flexible around Iris's schedule, which Renata had insisted on in the term sheet negotiation, and which Nathan had been prepared to negotiate for and had not needed to. He kept the IT support